Okay, where to begin with this, God's sake. That Scotland game literally sent me for a loop. I've been avoiding talking about this at all costs with family, friends, everyone. I wander the world wondering, what is life? What is the point? What am me? This crisis of self is mainly due to the fact that I support a team that in the same tournament threw away a 31-point lead, but also beat the second best team in the world at the time, in one of the best performances I've ever seen from an England side. What is life? I don't even know where to start in analysing the state of England's affairs at the moment. I'm just so upset and confused. I guess I'll give a brief summary of England's history before we got to the Six Nations. 2018 was a bit of a crapshoot, with the Six Nations starting off well with them dismantling the Italians and grinding out a victory against the Welsh in the rain. But then the wheels came off with defeat both to Scotland in Murrayfield and France in Paris, and then at home to Ireland. And the entirety of English fandom was sort of like, oh crap. Ah well, it's a different form, nothing to worry about. It's all good, we have a tour against South Africa coming up, and if we win that series, we will be fine. But England didn't win that series, throwing away considerable leads in both the first two games. We did win the last match of the tour, with Eddie Jones finally giving Cipriani a start. Then the Autumn Internationals came around, and England generally handled themselves well, with them coming close to defeating the All Blacks, winning 3 of their 4 matches, but there were still signs we had a long way to go, as the game with Japan needed us to bring Owen Farrell on to steady the ship. But to be fair, England had always been struggling with injuries, so there was always the hope that once everyone was fit and firing, England would be a force to be reckoned with, like in the first 2 years of Eddie Jones's reign. And the signs were promising going into the Six Nations, with Eddie Jones saying this was the strongest squad he could have picked from. With both the Vunipola brothers and Tuolangi fit and firing, I believed him. I was on board. And the first game of the Six Nations would be against Ireland, who were ranked second best team in the world, having beaten the All Blacks twice in their last 3 attempts. And it felt like this was the test for Eddie Jones's team to determine whether England would actually be contenders for this year's World Cup. And in one of the most physical defensive performances I've ever seen from an English team, England came out convincing winners against the Irish at the Aviva Stadium. And it's fair to say England fans were hyped. It was just a perfect performance, and the best I have seen an Eddie Jones England team play. As even when we were winning ugly, grinding it out, but this was just us getting sweet revenge in a convincing fashion. After the Irish gave us such a pasting at Twickenham last year and won the Grand Slam at our place. And England took that momentum onto their next game with France, where the French were exposed for their lack of out and out back 3 players, and England cut loose in the first half. They kind of stalled slightly in the second half, but that wasn't a cause for concern at all. But all was well, and England were 2 from 2, and then it was time for the next big challenge, Wales at the Principality Stadium. Now, Wales until this point hadn't really played well, despite being unbeaten in the last 12 games, and were continuing this winning streak by any means necessary, with a very scrappy win against France and an underwhelming performance against the Italians. It seemed like England had the momentum in what people were already dubbing as a Grand Slam decider. But Wales against England isn't any ordinary game, especially if the game is in Wales. Even though the first 15 minutes or so went well for England, seeing them take the lead and controlling the first half after a score from the standout Opposite flanker Tom Curry. But literally, the minute Carl Sinclair leaves the field, Wales get a foothold in the game, scoring 2 great tries, giving them victory in one of the best games of the championship so far. This was heartbreaking for us England fans. I think we probably, as a collective, hyped ourselves a bit too much about beating Ireland and dismantling a very poor French side. But it was no less disappointing, as Wales hadn't actually done much to beat us, and executed a very clever strategy from Warren Gatland, who would eventually steer his Wales side to a famous Grand Slam over the next few weeks. But this defeat didn't really seem to affect the team, as they took their frustrations out the next week on the Italians, with the English Polynesian backline contingent showing their worth in some highlight reel worthy stuff, and England coming out as extremely convincing winners, which sort of took the edge off the defeat to Wales in my eyes, as it seemed to confirm that we were still a good team, as it seemed like every other team in the championship would at least have an awkward time dealing with the Italians. And we were still in with a shot of winning the championship going into the last game of the tournament against Scotland at home, needing Ireland to do what we couldn't and defeat the Welsh in Cardiff. But the Welsh controlled that game, and the Six Nations was out of England's reach, leaving the game between Scotland and England a dead rubber, with nothing really being on the line apart from pride. And with the Scots having a bit of an injury crisis, bit being a humongous understatement, England were expected to be clear winners of this year's Calcutta Cup, bringing it back to Twickenham and avenging last year's pasting at the hands of Scotland at Murrayfield. The game started out with England immediately taking the lead and continuing to cut loose on the Scots, with England players looking in control and playing with confidence and bringing out all the tricks, storming to a 31-0 lead in 30 minutes. But then Farrell attempted a kick in behind that was charged down by Scotland hooker Stuart McAnally, and managed to beat both Owen Farrell and Johnny May to the try line, and Scotland had a glimmer of hope. But all of England were thinking, that was lucky, nothing to worry about. I literally stopped watching this game and went to rewatch the Wales game as I didn't get a chance to watch it at the time. As I came to realise that game was pretty boring, so I chose to flip back to the England game, and I was horrified at the scoreline I saw. Scotland were within 7 points of levelling the scores. How did this happen? Well, it was a combination of a sloppy start from England in the second half and Scotland playing with no fear and building up so much momentum that England seemed to be in shell shock. If only there was an English 10 that could change the way England play and get England out of this slump. If only. Anyway, this momentum reached its crescendo when Finn Russell set Johnson through for Scotland, and he executes one of the best finishes of a chance I've ever seen, as he both beat Daly and Knoll in spectacular fashion to score under the post, to send Scotland into a 7-point lead. I was fuming, but England surprised me, marching themselves up the pitch and creating the chance for George Ford to score under the post, and with the conversion the scores were level at full time, and breathe. So where do England go from here? Well, let's review the tournament as a whole, not just the last game, which is the lasting memory it seems for a lot of England fans. So England played the best rugby I've seen us play in this tournament, scoring their second highest ever tries total in the Six Nations, and that's with not a particularly creative attacking fly half steering the ship, but they also threw away games through lapses in concentration and execution in both the Wales and Scotland games respectively. And I think I know the reason why. England at the moment kind of play like an old school South African team, with dominance and physicality being paramount in the forwards, and in defence winning collisions has become a big focus under John Mitchell. This, when it works, is outstanding, and the best example of this being England's performance against Ireland, where all the emotional components leading up to this point resulted in England completely dominating the game, until the last few minutes where Ireland scored through sloppy defence around the guard. Now, at the time I didn't think much about this, I just thought of it as a consolation score, but what it actually was in fact a window into the weakness of this new style of defence and abrasive style of play that Eddie Jones's team has now lent into. This weakness being that this style of rugby can't, in my opinion, be sustained for a full 80 minutes. It's not even just about the players physically being able to maintain doing this, as I actually think it's more than possible for the players to do this. They will be well and truly fucked, but they can do it. It's more the mental toll playing like this takes on a person. International rugby is as intense as rugby gets, and with that intensity comes the mental stresses of playing at this level, with players having to remember so many things and think about so many other things as the game goes on, with them also having to read the game in front of them. Now, the way England play is extremely ambitious, and it has to be commended really for being attempted, but what it boils down to is having all that initial stress, then adding it on top of the most physically taxing styles of play that has ever been attempted, and to sustain that for 80 minutes whilst not dropping your levels of concentration for a second. Otherwise the whole system comes crashing down, which we have seen time and time again in the latter stages of the Six Nations. Now, you may be wondering to yourself, why would Eddie Jones want to use such a system, knowing how taxing physically and mentally it will be for the players? Well, I believe the answer is they have to, and Eddie Jones knows this, and this has, I reckon, always been in the back of his mind. Now come on a journey with me as we delve into the deeper nitty-gritty of Eddie Jones's reign so far, where I'm probably going to give Eddie Jones a lot of credit and benefit of doubt, which he may or may not deserve, but anyway, here it is. When Eddie Jones took over, whenever the media were brought into the England camp to see training, they were shocked at the intensity England would be training at before a game. It was ludicrous, but I believe Eddie Jones, after watching the English Premiership for 4 months, before the Six Nations began when he first got the job, analysed the strengths and weaknesses of the English game. The strengths were that the Premiership meant that you had players who were used to playing in an extremely physical and decent paced league, week in and week out, as well as the league being all about winning, so players' minds would already be geared to that winning by any means mindset. But the weakness of the Premiership was that it didn't allow for players generally to be at the level of outstanding creative international attackers, in the same way that Super Rugby does for the All Blacks, Wallabies and Springboks. So what you needed was a system and style that made this perceived weakness a strength and allowed their strengths to be steered in the best direction for the team, as England would have to become the most intense team to play against in the world, as skill-wise they couldn't really outclass teams like the All Blacks, so this system became the plan. In the short term, Eddie Jones didn't change too much from Lancaster's era, and just kept talking about the players needing a winning mentality, whilst absolutely ragging the players in training, saying this is all for the World Cup, and the results of this were really positive, with a Grand Slam in his first year in charge and a Six Nations Championship in his second, with them equaling the All Blacks' undefeated streak record in 2017. Then, in the 2017-18 season, he began to push his team even harder, so that they could be in the right physical condition to play in the start, with them getting through the Autumn International without too much trouble. But then came 2018. So Eddie, by all accounts, continued pushing the players in training. But England then became unstuck against teams who'd figured out England were living off their opponents' mistakes, and they finished in their lowest ever Six Nations place in almost a decade. So Eddie Jones begins steering England in this new direction and style for their 3-test tour of South Africa. The result became England became really good at starting games, with them bringing energy and physicality that South Africa just couldn't deal with in the opening exchanges of the first two tests. But that same weakness that I talked about before cropped up, where South Africa came back because England weren't able to maintain this. This time they could only do it for 25 minutes, as they lost both tests after throwing away considerable leads, twice in one of the games. England won the third test, so there was a glimmer of hope that this style could work, although it wasn't as blatant a focus as it has become in the Six Nations. And in the autumn internationals, Eddie seemed to steady the ship as England fans were all getting really nervous, thinking we had peaked way too early. But a few gritty wins against South Africa and Australia calmed the nerves, as well as almost beating the All Blacks at Twickenham, with that game having England fail to hold on to a 15-0 lead, only being able to keep up this intensity for around 37 minutes this time. But they were getting better at it. I think after this, Eddie Jones realised he couldn't keep ragging the players before these international games, and he said as much before the Ireland game this Six Nations, saying how he pushed the players too hard, but now he knows how hard he can push them, and the result of him taking care of the players between games is what we have now, a team who can mix it with the best of them for about 50 or 60 minutes at 100%, resulting in a second place finish in this extremely competitive 2019 Six Nations. And that is all with, in my opinion, England still holding themselves back slightly, with the likes of Cipriani, Alex Good, Sam Mercer and Sam Underhill not being able to be part of the squad through injury or just Eddie Jones' personal preference. Speaking of Eddie Jones, if he could cool it with the mind games, like everyone hates England enough, the team doesn't need extra incentive for the opposition to get fired up on. England aren't good enough that this stuff doesn't matter. Anyway, where can England go from here? Well, I feel like the last Six Nations game has put a massive damper on this Six Nations, which in general has been a massive improvement for England, and English fans can be a lot more confident going into yet another crap group at the World Cup. But I do struggle to see England getting past the semis if we're lucky, as unless Eddie can get England firing for 80 minutes of every game in this World Cup, this new style of play we play with will be extremely hard to maintain, which isn't the best place for an England team to be in. And I guess where we go from here is slightly up in the air. I think that's okay, and I think we'll be okay. Signed NGJ.